call City Hall, utility building, or somebody. So, and I decided not to clutter up time with that issue, but then this is another issue.
Okay, and if you can sit to the microphone, that's helpful, so the folks at home can hear you.
Which doesn't matter which one.
It doesn't matter, but you'll need to push that little button in the front it makes it red. That makes it live.
Thank you. I'm Brent Thompson. I live at 582 Allison Street. I'm a former planning commissioner, city councilor, transportation commission person, airport commission person, and downtown beautification person. And years ago, when out of the recession of the 80s, we had a planning action up on Walker Street in Peachy. And the issue was, okay, we're taking in this subdivision, but the issue became, where does it say we need this land that we have not got buildable lands inventory? And everybody went, I don't know. So another planning commissioner and I said, well, we think that someone should prove that we need this land before we just annex it, even though it's in the urban growth boundary. So that began the whole campaign to begin to limit the sprawl of Ashland. So then future annexation requests required really that they showed that this land was needed, that we didn't have an adequate supply. So that has been carried on for a long, long time. And then when we had regional problem solving, the council did a buildable lands inventory and realized that we really could get by with what we have until 2050 or something, but we have to be creative. And so that was why I came today, because I believe the city is moving in that direction, and I'm really pleased with it. I was alarmed when we had the annexation request for 250 units that are all going to drive on North Main every day, adding 2,380 vehicle trips to North Main at 10 vehicle trips per unit. So I'm really glad that Brandon Goldman and his staff have worked up a situation where it's not going to be so crucial for the city council to feel that they need to grab land on the perimeter to accommodate growth, because basically every single family dwelling in this city can now have an accessory dwelling in it. And I think that the staging of systems development charges according to size is a brilliant move. So I just want to laud the direction that you're going. And it seems to me that now that that planning action approval has expired on North Main, there's no need to ever renew that. In other words, above the car dealerships. I don't believe there's ever a need to redo that because, again, every single family dwelling in town potentially could have an accessory dwelling in it. That is where we'll get our multifamily zoning. And I've been a landlord for too long now, and one of the questions people always ask me, is this unit or that unit in a big complex? Because the people who come to our community want uniqueness, they want something special, they don't want to be in a big stamp out complex owned by a real estate investment trust. And so if we keep things small scale, which is the charm of Ashland, I think we can achieve that. So I want to laud the direction the planning director is taking your program. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. We move on now to the buildable lands inventory update.
Thank you, Mayor and City Council. Brandon Goldman, Community Development Director. And to my right is Aaron Anderson, Senior Planner. And Aaron has graced us with his presence this evening because he was the primary staff person working on the Buildable Lands Inventory Geographic Information System data set, as well as wanted to thank in absentia Leah Richards, who has developed the map that was just handed out before you to represent that data in a map form. One thing I wanted to note is that when we talk about a buildable lands inventory, it really is an update of all the buildable lands within the city. So it quantifies the amount of vacant land and partially vacant land. It doesn't quantify what land is currently available for development. A lot of that land is locked up in private ownership. Property owners may not be putting it on the market, but it is entitled to be developed under the existing underlying zoning that would allow for its residential or commercial development, depending on the zoning of the property. And we also wanted to note that the buildable lands inventory is really a companion document for a lot of the long-range planning documents that we produce. In 2019, we did a buildable lands inventory that identified how much land capacity was within the city, and that informed the development of the housing capacity analysis in 2021 to, with that amount of land, how much housing can you accommodate? And then with that information, the third part of that combined document was the housing production strategy. We can accommodate X amount of units within the city under certain zoning, but how do we make sure that those housing units get developed? And that was the housing production strategy, which I'll touch on in a moment. But essentially, you know, as the slide before you, it does provide really a conservative estimate of how much land can be accommodated through development at the base densities. As you know, we do see a lot of development that comes in and looks at, well, I could develop 4 units on this lot, but I'm going to go ahead and propose to do 6 units on that lot and do some of those units as smaller, and therefore they count as less density. And as such, we do see performance that exceeds what was expected in the 2011 and 2019 buildable lands inventory, which is another way to gauge that we have perhaps a little more capacity within the city than the minimum allowances set forth in the code. But in order to be conservative with the buildable lands inventory, it's important to show if somebody meets all the base densities, how many units should we expect on those properties. And so with that, it does perform create a factual basis for future development. And we did an assessment of how much acreage is within the city and all zones. And Aaron will go into the minutia on some of the assumptions used, but I did want to touch based on some of the key findings, is that currently there are 288 net buildable acres within all zones in the city, and 630 acres when you include the land that's within the urban growth boundary, which is outside of the city limits, but within the area that we anticipate urbanizing within the next 20 years, for a cumulative of 980 or 888 acres, 985, math doesn't work on that. So that's a switch from gross acreage to net acreage. But nonetheless, I think the important part is that we look at lots on a lot by lot basis and determine that even if a lot is 10 acres, if half of it is within the floodplain, it has a net developable 5-acre development. But we do on the back end an assessment of how many units can be fit on that 5 acres, and you can transfer density out of that floodplain area onto the remaining land. And as such, we'll have a unit count potential. And that's the other part of the finding, is how many units can be accommodated on those parcels. And essentially, we've identified that you could accommodate 1,407 dwelling units within lots that are currently shown as vacant or partially vacant within the city limits, and an additional 1,300 outside of the city limits, but within the urban growth boundary. I know Mr. Thompson was going to speak tonight, and I spoke with him on the phone before, but I do feel like at this point, in relation to the slide, I'll note that the buildable lands inventory looks at everything within the urban growth boundary and makes an assessment of how much land is needed. It does demonstrate that we have an adequate supply to accommodate 20 years of growth, which is what the state requires a buildable lands inventory identify within our urban growth boundary. There are some types of land that we're right up against that 20-year limit within the city limits, and we'll go into some issues. So if somebody were to come forward with an annexation request, what Mr. Thompson referenced as a code requirement that you demonstrate that there's adequate land within the city limits in order to justify an annexation, that section of code was removed from our land use code probably about 5 years ago, which required a demonstration of less than a 5-year supply. Currently, they'd have to demonstrate that they are in conformance with the underlying zoning or comprehensive plan and make that application. So I wanted to make that clarification at this point, that the buildable lands inventory does, however, show that even using these conservative estimates, that there's adequate land within the city. If you look at it, we'll get into some detail when Aaron presents, because a lot of those lots are small 1 and 2 unit potential. And so there's also a difference in terms of how many lots can accommodate larger scale development. But with that, again, I mentioned we did the 2019 buildable lands inventory, the housing capacity analysis, and the housing production strategy. Even though we're doing a buildable lands inventory now in 2024, it's going to help inform future planning efforts, such as the economic opportunities analysis, which is in the pipeline in terms of what economic land need we have. One of the things that the consultant would typically do is prepare a buildable lands inventory in order to inform that. We've preempted that by doing it at the staff level to provide it to the consultants in terms of an accurate assessment of what land is currently vacant or partially vacant within the city. So the housing capacity analysis, just to refresh your memories, that it did determine that the city needs to accommodate 858 years over the planning, or 858 dwelling units over the planning period. And this was really based on the projected population growth that is expected. As Derek went through updating this buildable lands inventory, we took an opportunity to look at the Portland State University population projections that have come out since the 2021 housing capacity analysis, just to see if it was commensurate. And it is anticipating Ashland growing at a slightly higher growth rate, but still less than a 1% annual growth rate. So again, that does still demonstrate that we have adequate capacity to accommodate that. This slide might be a little small to read, but for those of you that want to look up Exhibit 71 at home, that shows the breakdown in terms of how many housing units would be needed, and does show that, single family, there's a large surplus of single family zone property. Where we're at the margins is really in the multifamily and high density residential. And both of those zones are zones that are within the city limits exclusively. So you do see through this assessment that it showed at that time we had a capacity for 177 dwelling units, and that capacity, that the demand was for 172. So a little bit more than is necessary for a 5-year build out, or a 20-year build out. So if you move on.
So Brandon, do you want everyone to hold their questions until you're done?
This being a study session, I think it's great if you guys have questions for the dialogue and discussion as we go. If I hit on the subject, or if Aaron does, please interject with any clarification question.
Could you go back to the previous slide?
Yeah. So one thing on this slide to note is Croman Mill District.
Yeah.
It shows a capacity of 160 dwelling units. It's because the existing district has mixed-use zoning for the area that would annex into the city, as well as along the far western property line adjacent to the residential districts. Most of the Croman Mill designation is office and employment and doesn't allow residential. I know that you've received presentations from Townmakers LLC looking to increase the density of residential in that area. Their discussions are between 450 and 550 unit potential. So again, even our buildable lands inventory today, looking at the existing zoning of those properties, is looking at this more limited development potential, not what could be achieved through a rezone and of the property as proposed with the new master plan.
So I do have a question.
Yeah, Councilor Kaplan.
Yeah. Thanks, Brandon, and thanks, Aaron, for all of this. I've been following, all of these different documents over the last few years pretty closely. But this table, I think, is really interesting. What I think it's saying is, first of all, the high-density residential, that we are pretty well set for high-density we've got space, we've got capacity quite a bit excess capacity for meeting the demand for the high-density residential. And that's before we even talk about the Croman Mill District, which I understand the town makers have said that they are also intending to put in some high-density residential. So just want to confirm that that's the case. So I have
It is. It's R3 zoning is what the high-density 20 units per acre. And so the capacity that's shown here does include a lot of R3 zone properties that may have one unit on them and can have another or another two. So we want to touch on a distinction between just raw land capacity and number of units and type of development, because one additional unit on a property is not the same thing as a fourplex or eightplex.
Okay.
So we're low on those larger lots.
Fair point, but that takes me to my bigger question, really. You've separated out the Croman Mill District as a separate district, of course. Eventually, if it gets developed, it would be a climate-friendly and equitable area. That's a minimum of 15 units per acre. When I think you've told us before that we have the ability on this council to require an even higher minimum, that 15, if we wish to. So that could actually satisfy a lot of all types of this need if that proceeds. I'm wondering where the railroad yard fits in all of that.
Yeah, so the railroad is not a residentially zoned property. There's a residential overlay that includes most of the railroad property, but not all. And so in a E1 zone property, you can do 15 units per acre. Our buildable lands inventory took E1 commercial lots that could do 15 units per acre and gave an assumption that they're not all going to develop with residential. So it's a 50% reduction in the BLI. When I think we touch on assumptions, we can mention that. But so it does have some housing capacity included in the BLI, but not at the climate-friendly area densities.
Right, and once again, since that is designated as a climate-friendly area, once the regulations come out on that, we would expect that to be at least 15 or higher if we choose to require higher, even though that's currently zoned as employment commercial.
Yes, depending on what's ultimately adopted by council, the climate-friendly areas state if you're doing single-use residential, you have to do at least 15 units per acre, but it doesn't preclude somebody from developing commercial only in a commercial zone. So somebody could build no residential in a climate-friendly area, but if they're proposing residential, then it has to be high-density residential.
Interesting. And we take the whole thing as, or it's by parcel? By parcel.
Yeah.
Councillor Hanson.
Thank you.
Hi, Aaron, could you go back 2 slides to that average? Oh, maybe it was that one. We had an average up there for, yes, thank you, over the last 6 fiscal years, 90 units. I didn't see that in the packet. Thank you.
And I have a follow-up while we're on this one. So if I'm reading this correctly, each year for the last 6 fiscal years, we've had 90 new units come on. So that's 540 units. Is that correct? My math
this is covered
working.
on page 26 of the document.
Right. So my question is really, so in the last 5 years, 560 units have been produced, and we are planning for 858 over the next 20 years. And I know we have to use the Portland University numbers, but I think it's kind of obvious, right, that there's a bigger conversation here about, we're talking about lower income units that are not produced by the market, that we're talking about people who are not so keen to maybe sell that developable land, all of those sorts of things. So how do we think about those two numbers when we know what has happened over the last 6 years? We know that almost any house you would build in Ashland would be sold or rented. How do we think about this document in terms of this? Or can we simply continue to develop, and at the point where we feel that pinch, we can come back and do another buildable lands inventory?
Yeah, so I would note that the buildable lands inventory doesn't set any policy.
Right.
So you guys have set the policy with the housing production strategy. That's what we do to try and get the types of housing that we need. The buildable lands inventory is a snapshot in time as to what the development capacity is currently. If we start seeing, again, continued 90, 100, 200 units per year, I think we'd need to look at redoing the buildable lands inventory, and those numbers, that development will feed back to Portland State University and inflate the growth rate according to how many housing units are historically being built in Ashland each year. So in a sense, it ends up I can't think of the term, but essentially that production informs that number of housing units that are needed by changing the population projections based on housing starts.
Yeah.
So,
And all of the changes that we're making in terms of the climate-friendly areas and Chroma Mill development and all of that is going to affect
yeah,
this.
and once those
but-
all get adopted, that changes the underlying zoning, and it would make sense to update a buildable lands inventory to show the
Okay.
new capacity based on new zoning.
Great. Councillor Dale.
Thank you, Mayor. So that just occurs to me as you were saying that, excuse me, that process that you describe right there and that feedback loop seems like there would be an inherent delay. How would we be able to keep up in real time with the immediate demand or supply or the inventory? Because it just seems like we would be constantly behind relative to
It
that.
used to be that cities would do their own population projections. Cities didn't often do population projections, and so the state stepped up and said, we'll pay for all populations projections to be done through Portland State University. So I think one answer is that we could, hire a consultant to do a population projection independent. It wouldn't be something that could be used for planning purposes under state law, but it would inform decision-making and policy as far as if we're keeping up with actual growth.
Thank you.
Councillor Kaplan,
I don't know if you had a question first.
did you have your hand?
Yeah, I did.
Councillor Duquesne.
Thank you. Thanks, Mayor. Bob had some great questions and kind of answered my questions there. Thanks, Brandon. But didn't Portland State say that we grow how much? A little under?
We do have some slides to show that. We can fast forward to that if you want. It's part of the demographic data section of our presentation that we're going to go into.
Yeah, we can just get to that when it comes. Councillor
I
Kaplan.
do have a question first. Thanks. So all of this brings to mind, I guess, maybe the obvious question that hadn't occurred to me before, which is that, yes, this is all driven by the Portland State University demographic projections, population projections, but that population projection would play out differently in different cities, depending on whether those dwellings are used for dwellers or for visitors. Second homes, other kinds of things. So how does the demand for dwellings get adjusted to reflect the local use of those
Sure.
dwellings?
So in doing the housing capacity analysis, population projection was one factor.
Right.
Vacancy rates are another factor. If we have high vacancy rates, we need more units. People per household is another substantive factor. We start moving to 1 and 2 person households instead of 3 or 4 person households. You need twice as many units to accommodate the same number of people. So, and the other factors that went into there, one was the number of units that are used as vacation rentals.
Okay.
So that was a factor that Eco Northwest looked at in developing the housing capacity analysis projection of how many units do you need to include a subset of those that are expected to be vacation rentals. I want to reiterate, we don't allow vacation rentals to be developed in our single-family neighborhoods, so we're probably not as impacted in that arena as some communities, but we do have a lot of, because all of our vacation rentals require owner occupancy, so it doesn't actually remove a resident dwelling unit from the equation. It just means that they're accommodating tourists within spare bedrooms or on their property.
But they could be occupied, they could be owned by somebody who doesn't intend to ever rent it and just occupy it when they're here a couple of months a
True.
year. And
Yes.
particularly if they're smaller units that
Yeah.
may lend themselves to that. Smaller units in, the walkable downtown area would particularly lend themselves to that, and making sure that we're protecting those units for people who actually live here,
Yeah.
and not just people who like to visit here.
Yeah, and I do recall that conversation with Eco Northwest and the Housing and Human Services Commission when they were reviewing that document in 2021. I know it was a factor, I just don't remember how it was actually incorporated.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
So we've touched on housing production strategies, you're familiar with it, I just wanted to note that those are in place now. So, and with that, I think that we're moving on to the buildable lands inventory demographic stuff and hopefully addressing some of Councilor Duquesne's questions. And I'll turn it over to Aaron.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Pleasure to present before you. As Brandon mentioned, my name is Aaron Anderson. I'm a senior planner on staff. And I'm going to be covering basically a brief highlight of updated to demographics that is covered in the document, not as quite as extensively as in the document. Some of the assumptions with how we derived the data, and then how that relates to the land supply based on building permits. And then finally, we'll go through the BLI map in some detail and look at examples that have updated since 2019. The population numbers, as we were just getting into, are all done by the Coordinated Population Forecast in PSU. This was done due to a change in state law in 2015. As Brandon mentioned, prior to that, municipalities were in charge of doing their own population forecasts, and now it's all in the hands of experts. They take into account a great number of detail, including birth and death rate, migration, and then there's a lot of complexity in how they model individual UGBs and then the county at large, and then reconcile those figures. And as Brandon mentioned, a portion of that does come from actual home production rates of municipalities, so there is a bit of a feedback loop in that element. This is the table from the most recent population projection. It runs all the way out to 2072, which is a very, very long forecast. And I think it's important just to realize that, current fares change from time to time. When looking at growth rates compared to other sub-areas, Ashland's growing at a slower rate. And so over the period of time, even though Ashland continues to grow, we grow at a slower rate, and so our share of the county's population decreases. So over this model's projection, Ashland accounts for 9.9 of the county population at present, but it's projected to decrease down to 9% in 2072. And again, please feel free to interrupt me at any time if there's questions or discussion points as we're going through any of this. This shows the population model again through 2072 with an expected population of 28,015. But again, caution should be used in such long time series. In terms of age cohort, the U.S. is aging rapidly, but we also see it here pretty dramatically. This is 7 different time series, all ACS census data, and you can see the 60-plus line going from 23% of the population in Ashland in 2010 to 35% presently. And you can see the less than 19 really showing the opposite of that. When we look at that in comparison to Jackson County and Oregon, the relationship is not surprising that you see that we're much older than the state generally and the county, and with the expected relationships in the under 20s. And here is the national average for comparison. So while Oregon is generally just slightly higher than the 60 plus, Ashland itself is considerably higher than the national average. And you can see the same expected pattern in the lower ages. Briefly, for those who are not aware, population pyramids are a way to examine the shape of population and whether it's growing, expanding, or contracting. And so 2 really dramatic examples here are Angola on the left and I believe Japan on the right, just for comparison. This is the city of Ashland's population pyramid. You see this very bimodal distribution of 20-year-olds and the 60 and older crowd. And as I mentioned before, when you get into the census data into smaller communities, the margins of error do go up. And so for illustration purposes, I also included our population pyramid with the margins of error for that data. And so the real shape could take anywhere in those ranges. In terms of comparing this to the U.S. is getting older. You can see the bulge kind of progressing up across each of these. This is 2000, 2010, and 2020. Between 2010 and 2020, populations of 65 and older saw the largest and fastest growth of any decade since 1880 to 1890. So that's just a truth of the entire country. Shown here is basically the same sort of data but overlaid. So you're seeing 2010 and 2020. 2010 is in boxes and 2020 is the color. And then you see the baby boom generation highlighted. Again, we see the same exact sort of shift over a decade scale here in Jackson County, and just sort of informs the age structure of Ashland, and as well as the county is getting older. In terms of household size, one of the things that is notable is the continued theme of smaller and smaller household sizes, but it is interesting that you see a split between owner-occupied and rent-occupied. The document talks about the total persons per household, which was 2.06 in the housing capacity analysis by comparison to what's being shown here. Again, in household size, this is showing the comparison of Oregon, Jackson County, and the city of Ashland. They actually report the data for households of 4 or more persons. The reason I showed it as 3 or more is that's how it was done in the previous documents, and I wanted them to be comparable. But it's worth noting that Ashland has less than 10% of 4 or more persons per household, and the state and county both have 20% as 4 or more. In terms of, does anyone have any questions before we move on past that part? That really kind of is the highlight of the demographic portion of the document. In terms of, may I go on there?
Yes. Mhm.
In terms of process, the project starts as a geospatial project primarily, and every year this document gets worked on, it's really standing on the shoulders of the previous year's document. So the parcel data, which obviously is different from the 2019 parcel data due to subdivision and whatnot, is joined with the 2019 data by parcel number, and then building permit data is joined to that. And then by using definition queries, we're able to ask questions like, show me properties that don't have a categorization for this year, or show me properties that do have a building permit. And so we really resolve every parcel gets looked at from an update from the previous year. GIS is used to determine the net buildable area. The bulk of that work was done in 2019 in terms of quantifying steep slopes and flood area, and then calculating the remaining area in terms of density. As has been mentioned, ARUs are now permitted outright without any sort of special planning action. And we choose not to take those into account because there's many single-family neighborhoods that are just not going to develop to that level. But it is true that there are many, many properties, potential ARUs that could be developed that are beyond the numbers that are being reported here. And as Brandon mentioned when he was talking about the mixed-use development, we make an assumption that commercial developments with residential will not, we only allocate 50% of the allowed density to make sure that we're creating a conservative estimate. The 2 main lands that we're going to be looking at mostly are vacant and partially vacant. There's a number of different categories to take into account things like parking land, which previously was thought to not be redevelopable. It's interesting now because all of those lands that are categorized as vacant and parking potentially could redevelop in a way that we didn't think of in 2019. That was not revisited in this case. They're just, those stayed categorized as parking. So again, we're mainly focusing on vacant and partially vacant lands. And then finally, once all of the GIS data was done, it turns into a tabular output that's transferred over to Excel, and the final data set had a total of 9,126 records, and each one of those records having over 30 fields of data that we're able to then use pivot tables in Excel to summarize the data that's in the report. In terms of land supply in the city area, the city of Ashland has 4,258 acres within the city. This is, I believe, 8 greater than was previously reported. There's been 1 annexation since the 2019 BLI, and that was the Beach Creek subdivision, which would have shown up as an island right around here. There's a unique part of our city's political boundary where the city limits actually goes outside of the UGB. And when I first came across this, I wondered how the heck that could happen, and then it occurred to me that that long predated UGBs. The city's 1888 map shows that as being the boundary then, and obviously when the UGB was adopted, there was a deliberate decision that we weren't going to urbanize up into the woodlands there. So it does make for some odd summations in terms of size when you have a portion of your city limits that is outside of your UGB, which I believe is unique in Oregon, to us in all of Oregon. In terms of the bottom line, this slide is really a summary of the totals from tables 2, 3, and 4 in the report, reporting on gross and net buildable acreage, both within the city limits and within the UGB, and then total. And then this is the bottom line, figure 1, showing the potential dwelling units by comprehensive plan designation, city limits, and UGB. And it shows that, again, even with the assumptions that we made, identified 1,407 potential dwellings that could be produced within the city limits, and then another 1,303 within the UGB area. Now, the slide that we were spending some time on earlier, Exhibit 71 from the HCA, has been simplified here. That previous slide took into account capacity in the city limits, the required demand, and then what was available within the UGB. And so this is really a simplified version of that exhibit, again, showing the demand that was reported from the housing capacity analysis, and then the capacity that we have in the city for each ones of those types of land. And as Brandon mentioned, the multifamily residential, we were a little bit thin. And here with the updated numbers, it shows that even within the city limits, there's an identified capacity of 173, where the demand based on the HCA is 172 in multifamily, and then 123 versus a demand of 95 in high density. But it's important to also see what the shape of this data looks like. So these two values together, we went ahead and put into a histogram to show a distribution of the dwellings across those parcels. And so what you're seeing here is effectively, again, the distribution of the number of dwellings expected. And in the first bin, it's a single dwellings expected to develop. And in the second column there, you see that there's 37 parcels that are identified that have 2 dwellings, and so on. So by extension, we only have 3 parcels in the land inventory. This is, again, city limits only and multifamily zoned R2 and R3 only. So we're only talking about 296 parcels. So it's not the entire inventory, but just among those types of land, you can see that as we were looking for lots that have more and more potential, there's fewer and fewer of them. In terms of the map itself, again, we're mainly going to be focusing on vacant and partially vacant lands. And I start here with the 2019 map. And the reason I think it's important to take a look at the 2019 map, I'll draw your attention right here to Beech Creek because it's one of the few things that you can see change on a high level. Even when I know where to look, looking between 2019 and 2024, it doesn't tell the whole story. And so what I'd like to do is kind of go in more depth and tell that story in different neighborhoods. This is the North Mountain neighborhood. In 2019 is on the left and 2024 is on the right. And again, even when you know where to look here, it's not terribly dramatic, but we'll go ahead and walk through some of them. Right here is a parcel that was shown as vacant for 2 units in 2019, and now it's shown as not vacant. This is actually an error correction. It was mistakenly believed to be a developable lot, but it actually is the open space for the surrounding subdivision. And so in going through the data this year, that was realized and it was recategorized as a vacant open space lot and was taken off the inventory. Similarly, something you don't see very often here is where no parcel was in 2019, one is identified here. And this is actually, the reverse is true, where it became vacant because there was a demolition. And so again, that came through because demolition permits are one of the types of permits that we paired up with all of the parcel data. In terms of new development, this is the Kestrel Way subdivision, and you can see the two parcels that have since developed. We were expecting that we were going to get 18 units across those two parcels. And what ended up developing was 28 in terms of the single-family homes and the cottages that developed right there. That turns into a theme because, again, here's a lot that was projected to have 5 dwellings on it. And that property ended up developing with a 3-story apartment building that has, I believe, 28 units. There's some flexibility because the ground floor spaces can be commercial or residential. And so that's a place where, you know, it shows again how conservative that we're being. Can also go the other direction. Highlighted here is a parcel that we had identified for 15 dwelling units. And in the end, only 3 lots developed with a large dedication to open space. And then next we have the Magnolia Meadows subdivision. This was a subdivision that is just now under construction. It hasn't platted yet, which is why it's still showing as this large parcel. But by the next time we update this, that will show as a new subdivided neighborhood and be 11 new single-family homes. And then, of course, the remainder of this parcel someday we would expect would.
And if I could add that due to the allowance for duplexes or units with accessory units, those 11 single-family homes is shown as the base density, and what the subdivision proposed, 11 residential lots. Each of those lots could develop as duplexes, in which case we'd have 22-unit production on there. So again, but to be conservative in terms of the buildable lands inventory, 1 unit per single-family lot is what's calculated.
And we actually expect several of those lots to end up in that scenario. And then finally, these 3 stars that are highlighted here, here, and here are, even though this data was put to bed December of last year, and so each of those projects have since been approved. This is a 4-lot subdivision that it was recently approved. This is a 4-lot subdivision that is very near final plat, and this lot here ended up turning into a 3-lot partition, even though in 2019 we only expected we would get 1 additional lot out of it.
Councilor Duquesne?
Thank you, Mayor. I have a quick question on this that's been built, being built, going to be built. Are they all market rate, or is any of it workforce housing, or is it too early to ask that question?
In this neighborhood, they're market rate units that are being proposed and built. They're not affordable units. The affordable units typically are required by the city as merit of an annexation into the city will trigger a requirement for affordable housing. When they're voluntarily provided, like the Housing Authority getting grant funding and building 60 units over off of Clay Street to add to their existing 60. Again, those wouldn't be represented in the buildable lands inventory. It's purely a representation of the number of dwelling units to accommodate population households. So.
Okay, thank you.
And that's what we can expect, right? I mean, for the most part, unless it's a low-income housing developer, these permits that are going to come through, we should expect these to be market rate. We're kind of following up behind Councilor Duquesne's, because I know a lot of what we talk about is the affordable and workforce housing, not so much the market. And so, but just double checking, Aaron, as you go through and we're talking about how many units here and there, we should assume those are market rate.
Yes.
Yeah, so one thing, I think you're entirely correct in that assessment that if they're not required to have affordable housing units and not subsidized by an outside entity, they're not likely to be affordable technically under our program. I would note that a number of the units that when Aaron is bringing up, there were more units built than were expected, in large part because the market is for smaller units. We are seeing an increase in the number of 800 square foot cottages as opposed to a 2,400 square foot home. And so we may see 3 units on a lot instead of 1 unit on that lot. So they're not affordable units, but they might be more attainable than that 2,400 square foot single family home would be otherwise.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to go over to the West Village and surrounding area, and really the same story does repeat itself Here again, the 2019 BLI identified that we would hopefully get 26 lots out of that vacant parcel there. And in the end, it ended up being 37. Now, 12 of those are these small cottages here that I believe all were 800 square feet. But if it weren't for the cottage housing regulations, we would probably not have expected to see that high of a density. This, again, is another example of cottage housing producing more units than we expected. This was our first cottage housing development, and again, we originally had this identified as 3, and I could see that assumption with the frontage there and the frontage here, that would logically be 3. I don't think 4 would be possible, but they ended up getting 12 cottages. And then the Beach Creek annexation. Again, we originally expected we would get 42 lots based on the 2019 estimate, and while Phase 3 has yet to plat in total, it will be 53 residential lots when it's all said and done. And then just one final demonstration of the base density versus development potential. The Ross Johnson Tire Shop, if you look at it in terms of base density for the zone that it's in, you would expect to get 7 or maybe 8 unit apartment building there. But with the transit triangle regulations and the changes to parking regulations, it's quite possible you could have as many as 30 units on those 2 parcels there. So to wrap it all.
Aaron,
Yes, ma'am.
just real quickly, Councilor Hyatt.
Thank you, Mayor. Aaron, on this one, this goes to the vacant parking piece, correct? So, I mean, we know we said we're talking primarily partially vacant or vacant, but this is an excellent example of the changes in ORS allowing us to develop lands that are currently parking and subsequently resulting in hopefully more affordable units at a higher density, yes?
If someone wanted to develop this property to their maximum potential, they wouldn't be required to provide any parking. And their density would solely be limited to the forms that are dictated by the transit triangle in terms of setbacks. And so really it would, if you were to leverage a vertical income tax credit to it, you could potentially see quite a number of units on that lot.
So the transit triangle policy that the city put in place, combined with recent changes at the state level, are resulting in greater opportunity for infill and higher density.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the transit triangle provided that opportunity in and of itself.
But we were ahead of the curve with the state.
Right, but now with the state law and the council's recent change to remove parking requirements, it essentially makes that just outright far clearer than going through an overlay and transit triangle development. We're likely to see an application come in through the transit triangle overlay in order to increase densities, because it allows for greater increases in density in combination with the parking requirements being lessened or removed. I still think that you'll see some parking provided, but not necessarily 1 or 2 units, parking spaces per unit. So those do make that feasible, where 5 years ago, that would not have been possible on this property.
Thank you for sharing this example.
Go ahead.
And really just to wrap it back up, again, the demand from the housing capacity analysis calls for 858 dwellings over the 20-year planning period. Again, that's based on the expected population growth over that time. And the BLI clearly shows that even within the city limits alone, we are meeting that capacity and across the different housing types as defined by the housing capacity analysis. And again, with regards to the recent historic residential production, this document mentions, but I would like to call it out, that the most recent 23-24 fiscal year isn't here as it hasn't been completed. And so this is actually slightly underreporting some of the multifamily development, because over 50 dwelling units of the Midtown lofts were issued in this fiscal year. And then finally, the BLI is a living document. There's been a number of changes of state law that we've mentioned a number of times here. They include, in addition to duplexes and ADUs, middle housing land divisions, the removal of parking requirements. and the residential development on commercial lands, which is now potentially allowed. So that really, at the end of the day, this document is a conservative estimate of dwellings that could be developed. And in terms of next steps, the Planning Commission reviewed this document and forwarded it to council for your approval. There's some timelines for state notification, and so the formal adoption can't happen until July 16th, but we expect to bring a resolution back on that date for adoption. And finally, I would just point out that this BLI will now be used for ongoing efforts, both with the climate-friendly area work and also with an economic opportunity analysis. And I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Councillor Hyatt.
Thank you, Mayor. Aaron, Brandon, thank you. I have the privilege of seeing this twice because of being the liaison to the Planning Commission. And I have to say, I mean, even the second time around, I'm still picking up additional information. So it is very nuanced and there is a lot here. And I appreciate the time and the effort that has gone into compiling this. My question is related to the slide with the histogram combined with the example you showed with the parking. Is the histogram taking into account projects like the example of the tire shop? Or is that independent of those types of possibilities?
That tire shop would have, well, because of the parcelization, because there are two different parcels, it's highly likely that one of those was a 3 and one of those is a 2.
Okay, so it's being pulled in.
I would need to look at because those are two separate parcels.
Got it.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say through properties under joint ownership that are separate properties could be assembled to create larger developments. So you may have 3 lots, one that could do 4 units, 1 4 units, and 1 6 units. If they're all assembled under one ownership, that applicant is likely to come forward to do 16 units as one application. So it wouldn't be represented on this histogram, but it is achievable.
But the histogram may have examples within it where those can be combined and actually find themselves in the 7 or greater if they're co-located or in some way adjacent.
And that's a really good point because when you're talking about adjacent parcels, it's masking some of that if there are adjacent parcels that are under common ownership.
Excellent. Thank you for the clarity.
And one other aspect that this slide doesn't represent is the potential for multifamily development in our commercial and E1 zones. So this is R2 and R3, but we do anticipate were there a commercially zoned property that was doing ground floor commercial and wanted to do apartments upstairs, they would quickly fall into that higher development capacity of 8, 9, 10 units or more, depending on the size of that lot. So if you visualized an entire floor or 2 floors above Albertsons, for instance, that's quite a bit of housing in a commercial zone that could be accommodated had that property been developed in that manner. And in today's market, people are increasingly looking at doing that.
Excellent. Thank you.
Councillor Dale.
Thank you both, Aaron, Brandon. This is outstanding work as always. And Aaron, thank you for solving the riddle that lent itself to a significant amount of distraction over my weekend trying to figure out the UGB and City of Ashland down there. And that was, I didn't think to go back to 1888 plat map, but it's obvious, right? The question I have when you were pulling queries, and maybe I'm foreshadowing a little bit to the next agenda item, but did you pull in the vacant and partially vacant a query relative to city-owned in these 2 categories, and what percentage that might be?
What percentage of land the city owns?
That would fall into this vacant or partially vacant tax lots?
Yeah, typically it doesn't
It
fall
doesn't,
into
okay,
those
so-
because it's public ownership. So city parks, city
Right.
city hall, this building
you wouldn't be able
may
to
have
separate it
development
that way.
capacity, but it's not
Right.
assessed in the same way.
So all
as-
of the open space and the airport and stuff like that
Yeah.
would all
Right.
fall into, so you would not get valid data. Okay, so then, is there anything just off the top of your heads in what you guys know in institutional knowledge in the vacant and partially vacant city-owned percentage, if any?
There are some development opportunities on city-owned land within the city that, should the city declare it a surplus or already has declared it a surplus, could have additional unit capacity. So
And currently owned by the city, yep.
and currently owned by the city,
Got
which you are foreshadowing the next.
Thank you.
That's why they're both on the same night. So if there are no additional questions, thank you, Aaron and Brandon. One of the things that it strikes me when we see presentations like this is how fortunate we are that we have people who know how to bring data together and how to explain it. So thank you for doing the deep dive and showing us a couple of neighborhoods and how the data moves, because it can be a little overwhelming for people who aren't planners to understand how are we seeing this? And the questions, I think, come from being able to understand the data well enough to ask good questions. And so I know from talking with other mayors across the state that not everyone has access to this kind of data, so it makes it very difficult to make solid policy decisions when we're trying to solve challenges. And so thank you to both of you and to the department for helping us understand this situation and to bring this forward so that we can start to make more of those policy decisions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Changing seats.
Yeah. It's the same presentation, but I thought I would just append it to this land banking, if we're moving on.
I like that image.
So that's how that works.
Yes.
That doesn't grow on trees, it grows in bushes, you plant it.
Well, so this item, coming on the heels of that discussion with buildable lands inventory, I think is great because we don't have to go over all of that information, and I can focus in specifically on the housing production strategy. Identified land banking as one of the 15 strategies identified. And in that, it outlined a number of steps, and I've got those on the screen here. And again, these are steps that are within the city's control. There are nonprofit organizations or groups that could purchase property, hold property, but the city is in a unique position in order to either use existing surplus city property, to Councilor Dale's comment, or utilize city resources to purchase property and hold property. As a government organization, we don't incur property tax on that, and we have a great example of how this was utilized in the case of the Clay Street property, where the city purchased a 10-acre property in concert with the Housing Authority of Jackson County. They needed 3 acres in order to do a 60-unit development. The city at that time felt that we could purchase the full 10 acres. 7 acres would be retained under the city's ownership. We'd set 4 acres aside for open space in the form of wetlands and parks, and then have a portion on the south side that could be sold for residential development in some capacity, either affordable or market rate. Through the passage of time, the city held that property for a number of years until such point as the Housing Authority was prepared to do another project in Ashland and approached the city and said, would you be willing to sell us a portion of that 4-acre part? And the city was able to sell it back to the Housing Authority at the price per acre that we paid for it initially, I think 7 or 9 years prior. So, they were saved the market escalation that occurred. We didn't incur additional property tax liability during that time, and we're able to sell it to the Housing Authority at the cost that we paid for it, thereby providing a lot of subsidy to that development. So in a sense, that's the nature of land banking in a local example. What it does identify is that in order for land banking to be successful in the housing production strategy, it outlines that we need to do an inventory of public and privately owned properties that might be suitable and available for land banking, partner with a organization that could ultimately either hold those lands, or if the city held them, be prepared to acquire them as a nonprofit for the development of housing on it. And one of the things identified in the strategy was partnering with a community land trust as one partner that could do that, and obviously acquiring and maintaining that land until it's made available is not without cost. So something that the city would have to identify not just the acquisition cost, but the ongoing maintenance cost of it until such time as it's prepared for development.
Brandon, could you go back to that previous slide?
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit more to the third bullet where it talks about partnering with and contributing funds or land to an existing nonprofit land bank? That's distinct from the conversation
Yeah.
about the land trust. Could
It
you
is
just speak
because,
to that a
you
little
know,
bit more?
that assumes that there is an existing nonprofit land bank. There is not.
Right.
So the second part of that, which isn't bolded, or participate in the formation of a new nonprofit land bank. So that would be an organization that was established as a nonprofit specifically to acquire and hold property for affordable housing development. And they could, as an entity, then turn that property over to other affordable housing providers. But again, it's not a model that currently exists in Ashland. So it would be one of
But
those.
are we required, so as part of the housing production strategy, we are looking to do that rather than hold it as a city?
It's one avenue.
It's one avenue that we're investigating.
Yeah, I think the housing production strategy would, the city is committed to looking at land banking and determining how best to proceed, but it would be fully within your discretion and the council's discretion when adopted as to how that takes form.
Okay, thank you.
And I think part of what the mayor was just referencing is developing those partnerships and coordinating with not just nonprofit developers, but also for-profit developers, community groups to develop affordable housing. Speaking a little bit off script here, with recent annexations, we've had developers that were obligated to provide a percentage of affordable housing and have worked cooperatively with Habitat for Humanity, for instance, to build some of those units. Other developers have looked at, are there alternative organizations that can accept the land dedication so that the market rate development can go forward and the affordable housing criteria could be met. The land bank that were established would be one mechanism, even under our existing land use rules that states dedication to an affordable housing provider, 501c3, a government organization such as the city of Ashland. So if there were a mechanism set up where the city could receive those lands and then make those available for nonprofit affordable developers, that could satisfy that annexation criteria. It's not without considerable risk because now the city has taken on those lands and we're not housing developers. And so it takes on additional obligation to seek out, find those partners and in order to develop that property, which is currently being done by the market rate developers to find those partnerships. And also stewardship and oversight, maintaining and monitoring those properties over time, again, noted previously.
Councillor Kaplan?
So Brandon, what you talk about is considerable risk because we're not developers. Essentially, that's the risk that we took on when we bought those acres off of Clay Street that are currently Snowbury. Is that right? So we just did that.
Exactly.
We didn't have a land bank. We just held it. We held it for a number of years, you said.
Right.
We maintained it. And we.
Yeah, and we've not been necessarily active in terms of putting those properties up and saying that we'd like to see an affordable housing developer that can come in and develop them in short order. I know that that's the objective of that portion of Clay Street, the long-term objective. So again, it's not necessarily financial risk other than the cost of maintaining it. It's, I guess what I'm speaking to is the impetus to get those units on the ground earlier rather than later.
Right.
The private developer has a motive to do that and move forward to complete their subdivision, whereas if the lot was just put into a land bank, that may be assembled and at a future point, an RFP issued, and
So in a sense, there was, and I sent you a question about this earlier in the day, I'm not sure if you saw it, about the surplus city land, surplus city property. In a sense, there's surplus city property that you can almost think of it as our own kind of quasi land bank waiting for us or somebody else to decide, well, let's go now move forward and develop it.
Yeah, it's exactly right. Some of that property, I think, falls neatly into that category. Some probably doesn't, and I did get your message, so I'm prepared to point out those.
Councillor Duquesne.
Thanks, Mayor. So Brandon, pointing out things, something that I think Councilor Dale brought up earlier is that on Clay Street. So there's Snowberry 1 and 2, and then on the corner of Clay and something, and we own that property that's a house with the tree and it's all fenced in. That is surplus property, correct?
It is.
That the city owns, and that, could that fall under land banking, that the city owns this? And would that possibly be able, when I was reading in the packet, not just housing, but also child development, and we are desperately in need of daycare here in Ashland. And so when I was reading that, and I know that Jackson County Housing and Snowberry in the city did what they did, well, Jackson County Housing in the city, can you tell us a little bit about the surplus? And that is a little quasi-land banking that I think that Bob touched on, but can you tell us a little bit more about how that could possibly be developed?
Yeah, so that property, and I've got a slide on it in a bit that shows its acreage and residential development capacity. I would say that childcare facilities under state law can be located in residential neighborhoods. So that is a allowance that were there a childcare provider that wanted to partner with the city or a nonprofit organization that's developing housing on that site could make that proposal and move forward with that. I think it is a council decision in terms of the final disposition of that property, but it does have that opportunity to develop both as housing and, I think, depending on the scale of the child care facility, could be allowable in a residential zone. So something on the scale of the YMCA probably would require a rezone, but if it meets the state requirements for a child care facility and their thresholds that they establish, it could go in a residential neighborhood.
I think it would be perfect.
And a follow-up behind Councillor Duquesne's question, which is, we are having so many conversations about that combination of housing and childcare. So when we think about land banking, it's come to us through the housing production strategy, but we could in fact create a land banking strategy that goes out beyond housing production and looks at other things that we might need, like childcare, like some of those other elements.
You know, parks and open space is also a land banking strategy. Acquiring property for conservation purposes can be seen as land banking by nonprofits.
Okay, great, thank you.
I love that idea.
So this is leveraging some of the information that Aaron prepared and to look at that residential development capacity. It could fit in the BLI document, but I was thinking in terms of if the city was proactively looking at properties for acquisition. Again, these don't include the public properties. We'll touch on those in a second. But these are the lands that could have 2 units or greater. You bring that up to 4 units and greater, you can see the number that disappeared. When we go to 8 units or greater, yet more lots are not capable of accommodating that level of development. Then when you go to 15 units or greater, we're now mostly isolated to areas outside the city limits, but within the urban growth boundary. And that is, consistent at 25 units and greater. So I just kind of wanted to show this map as to if you're looking at larger scale multifamily residential development, there is really limited land area within the city limits and urban growth boundary that can accommodate larger scale developments. And I think that's part of the difficulty that organizations like the Housing Authority have in citing properties for larger scale multifamily development.
So, Councillor Kaplan?
Just to make sure I'm understanding it. So there's 168 acres total, which that's what the heading says. There's 25 of those. Each one of them able to accept at least 25 units per parcel. Is that right? And that when we see
so there could be adjacent properties under same ownership that could increase that number and fall into this category.
So we see that in the railroad yard. There's 2 parcels.
And this, each of them would have 25 unit capacity under the buildable lands inventory because of that 50% of the employment use. So I think they're substantially higher than that, but.
And that chunk that's blue and pink in the middle, that's normal.
Yeah, and so the blue there is because they're large lots that have a single-family home on them. So, they are, for instance, if you could accommodate 25 units on this parcel right here, and there's only one unit on there, there's enough room for 25 more. So that's why they're blue,
Got it.
because they will develop at a greater density once annexed.
And that pink area just to the right of I-5, what is that?
This right here?
Yeah.
Is behind the Ashland Hills.
Behind the
Inn.
Ashland Hills.
There's quite a bit of land up on that hillside that you never get to unless you go through their property, so.
It's owned by doesn't matter.
It is adjacent to the freeway on one side, Ashland Hills Inn to the south, and the extension of East Main Street on the north. But it's really up on a hill, so you can't necessarily see it unless you drive up there.
Councillor Hanson?
Thank you, Mayor. Brandon, on North Mountain, we have that floodplain property. Yeah, I'm surprised that that is not residential, 2 or 3. Could you talk about that property a little bit?
Yeah, well, it's a pretty large property. I don't have the acreage on it, but I'm just in glancing at it, it looks like it's probably around 8 acres in size, and we can get an accurate number. But as part of the North Mountain Neighborhood Plan, it was envisioned to accommodate probably about 25 additional units.
Okay.
It has the floodplain area is really the south half of that property, and then the north half is where all of the development would occur. It is privately owned, and it came up when we were discussing some of the, I'm trying to remember what code amendment we were proposing, but it is a single lot that is owned by an individual, and if they wanted to build a single-family home on that property, they could. And that might impede the future development of 25-plus units. We would ensure that they don't locate that house in the floodplain, as you noted, and also ensure that transportation connections go through that property. But as a privately owned property, people are entitled to build one unit if they choose to build one unit. So that is something that could happen. So.
Great, thank you.
Brandon, when we talk about units, dwelling units, we're talking units that are at least 500 square feet?
We're not, but I think that's the standard. So, if your unit meets building code, we've processed and approved units that are 160 square feet in Ashland as accessory residential units. Ingress, egress, bathroom dimensions are met. You can build a lot in a small space as a small studio.
Right, and I know that there have been some conversations, particularly about that Clay Street property with the different densities, and I think you're going to talk about it here soon, but one of the housing types we know we need is single, very small units for people who are maybe in transition, who are just kind of getting on their feet, or who may be elderly and really are on a severely fixed income. And so when we think about these numbers, depending on that density and that size, that could also change the reality for some of these small lots, like that lot on Clay Street. Is that correct?
It would. Yeah, because we look at units that are 500 square feet or less as only counting as 3/4 of a unit. So then we get into the math of how many units can you accommodate. If the lot was only big enough to handle 3 full-size units, but if they're all 3/4 of a unit, then you could
you get more.
do 4.5 or 5 if they're affordable. So there are ways to increase densities by number of dwellings because of that proportional size of small units, not counting the same as larger dwellings.
Great, thank you.
So this gets to the city surplus land discussion that you had in June of 2022. I wasn't present at that discussion, so those of you that were will know better than I what was discussed. I did look back at the council communication that was done at that time and identified that there were essentially a number of city-owned properties that were discussed, namely North Mountain Avenue, which I'll touch on, Clay Street, which Councilor Duquesne raised, and East Main Street parking I don't think it's East Main Street. I think it's downtown parking that was identified as disposition. Then the B Street yard, the property on Hardesty property, the Imperatus property. And the reason I answered Councilor Kaplan's question about suitable for development, for instance, the Imperatus property, there's a lot of acreage that the city owns. It's exclusive farm use land that's not urbanizable and is not adjacent to our city limits. So it doesn't really provide that opportunity for land banking, even if it is city-owned public property. But to look at some that potentially are, the North Mountain property, this was declared surplus and staff was directed to proceed with disposition of this property, according to Scott Fleury. Specifically, we've already engaged a realtor to list and sell this property. It has the potential of 4 dwelling units and is part of the North Mountain neighborhood multifamily zone. And it does require half-street improvements. You can see it's not served by, you can't actually get there from here on this extension of mountain. The existing driveway is a dirt road, so you would need some measure of half-street improvement in this location to serve this property, as well as the property to its west that had previously gotten subdivision approval but did not move forward. The other property, the downtown parking lot, right here is just 5 spaces in the downtown. So that is a 0.6 acre lot that has 5 parking spaces that are currently leased. But Scott Fleury indicated that that lease could be terminated to allow for sale at any time. So, and then the 380 Clay Street, this is the property that was just raised south of the Snowberry Brook apartment development and across the street from Wingspread Manufactured Home Park. There is a 0.32 acre property that has an existing house that was built in, I think, 1890, 2-story house in a dilapidated condition, to be kind. That also has a large statue tree on that property and an open pit well on the property, each of which are some constraints to redevelopment. It's anticipated that the house would, having been inside the house myself 15 years ago, and the stairs were at such an angle that was not advisable to walk up them at that point in time. It would need a significant amount of repair or just demolition and replacement in order to maximize development potential for this lot. The lot is not as large as when prior discussions occurred, because this area was made as part of Snowberry Phase 2 and developed with affordable housing in that area. But this front area, again, remaining, could be developed as affordable housing, childcare facility, and I say 4 units. There is also density bonuses that our ordinances allow for affordable housing, so that you can essentially do a 65% increase in the density. So now we're up to 6 or 7 units. Then if those units are small, like 500 square feet, and they only count as 3/4 units, now we're pushing up to 9 or 10. At some point, you hit a functional limit of how much can fit on a 0.32 acre property. But that designers can do wonderful things. So. And then the other properties that came up at that point is the B Street yard, which you're all familiar with. It's 2.2 acres spread over 4 lots. It's currently zoned employment. So if it were to be developed exclusively as residential, could require a rezone. If it was developed as affordable residential under state law, that can be seen as an outright permitted use in an E1 zone property, and as such would not require a rezone for that use. My understanding is that the existing buildings and the use of this property they're still in use by Public Works, and as such, once the development of the Hardesty property was complete, and again, funding available for building of structures that could accommodate equipment out there, then this yard could be no longer necessary for operations and made available in that way.
Counselor Hyatt?
Thank you, Mayor. Brandon, you may not know the answer to this, so Sabrina, I'm going to phone a friend. With regard to the Hardesty property, I remember that this council taking a vote on a building to house the vac truck and the street sweepers. What is the status of that construction down on Hardesty? Do we know?
I'll have to get with Scott and check.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up question to that as well, because I know that you've talked about the separation of those two elements, and I don't know if you have a slide. Are we going to look at Hardesty here?
No, I don't have
Okay.
a slide for Hardesty.
It's very complicated,
That's outside our
Hardesty
city
is. But one of the things that I know that council's interested in is seeing the larger master plan process, or what is the larger master plan, and what are the elements that are not needed by the facilities and public works? Because there are some other potential things, not housing necessarily, but there are some other functional uses for the community that I think, well, I know there's a lot of interest in exploring once we have a better sense of what kind of acreage is that, because it is exclusive farm use.
Yeah, I know that just some familiarity. I worked with Paula Brown as she prepared the planning application that went to Jackson County for its allowable use for a relocated yard. And the fact that it had been used as a soils yard previously as a private individual, Mr. Hardesty, is what allowed the city's yard relocation to take place. But that plan did incorporate a number of other uses, as you identified, both natural area preservation, wetland mitigation. But again, that plan could be presented back to you.
Counselor Kaplan?
Yeah, Sabrina, do you know if that Hardesty property is part of the facilities master plan consultancy? Are they looking at that?
At the building, probably not, as we have no plan for the use of the actual house. There is some usage of the garages, is my understanding. But like Brandon said, there's additional uses the city would like to use on that property,
Yeah.
such as fire training and things like that. But to the mayor's point, part of the assessment we're doing is looking at where should we be operating out of? Like, where should we be serving the public? What buildings should we be using? So I'm sure that will be a bigger discussion once that assessment is made of where staff should be located and kind of what we want to do with that and then what's left.
And I think that that's for both the Hardesty and the Imperatrice property. And, there's a lot of opportunities there, not necessarily, again, for housing, but for other community benefits that we haven't been able to get to those bigger vision conversations around that. So I think, separate from the conversation about housing, but still in that same place of the city owning property that isn't quite the same thing as a park or an open space, but could have community partnerships that develop it into something that is of particular use locally. Go ahead. Oh, Councilor Duquesne?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I'd be very interested to see that also. The Hardesty property is a great property, but back to B Street. So I heard, Brandon, tell me if I heard you right. Did you say that where B Street is, it's employment and it can be used for housing, even there?
For affordable housing. So
Yeah,
state law
affordable.
specifically states that affordable housing is an outright permitted use in all zones.
And also,
So essentially in E1 and C1 zones in the city of Ashland, if somebody was to come in and want to develop affordable deed-restricted housing that meets our requirements for affordability and is deed-restricted for at least a 30-year period, the city could approve that application outright without having an exception or with a zone change being required. But the property is zoned currently for employment. So as council, as the property owners of that, looking at how best to use that, there may be an opportunity. You mentioned childcare earlier, that this zone allows for a greater intensity of use than the childcare facility in residential zones, and yet is also, the city could apply a residential overlay and do 15 units per acre on this 2.2 acres and achieve 30 plus units, or if they're all small units, we're back to like that 45 or 40 units potential on this property as well. But again, that would be finding that developer partner that wants to build that model of housing.
Thank you. I thought that's what you said, but I thought it was wishful thinking, so I wanted to hear it again. Thank you, Brandon.
Councilor Hanson.
Thank you, Mayor. Brandon, this property seems to be close to transitioning. I believe that the Hardesty property has the buildings that will house that additional equipment on the property. They just haven't been assembled yet. And if we have Hardesty zoning approved, it seems though we're pretty far down the road here. Maybe in 2025, the B Street property will be available. Who knows?
Yeah, I'll defer to Scott.
Right. But in lieu of that, council can move forward with a defined surplus strategy. So I'm curious, what does that strategy look like? And is it a start early and often type? Can we do that? Or do we have to wait for one domino to drop before we can start doing another thing? So in other words, can we identify this in 2024 as something that we want to move forward with and to help get the ball rolling? We don't have to actually like vacate and be out of there.
Yeah, I would
100%.
presume, and Sabrina can illuminate it, that the city would want to have a very clear timeline for when operations could be relocated before you would do anything along the lines of issuing a request for proposals or deed restricting the property or working with a nonprofit or a for-profit developer to put forth a proposal. Just because they wouldn't want to, any proposal they make is going to have to be built on the assumption of when they could take possession of the property. So you'd have to have that question answered.
Yeah, and I think in terms of having a strategy for surplus property, I think, the decision point goes back to potentially, the council's feelings on land banking. So recognizing that we're going to have a rather large lot, which is unusual for us, to do something with, is the idea that as we vacate this, we want to bank this land with the idea of building up enough vacant lots to be able to issue an RFP, to work with a developer to get housing built. And that is our strategy moving forward. And so we decide that, and that can be decided before we vacate the space, that's how we're going to use that. Or is there another will of council on how we should be viewing surplus property or how we should be thinking about land banking in general?
That's a good point, because as you've pointed out in other discussions, we're not just looking at one-offs, we're looking at a potential package to be able to present to a developer. So we really don't want to move on this particular parcel while other things are in play until everything's clear and we have a cohesive strategy.
Yeah, I think that's, the discussion of the strategy. What is our strategy? How much housing are we looking? How many lots do we want? What's our goal? I don't think 2.2 acres is going to get us all the affordable housing that we would like to bring in. So, what is the metric we're looking for in terms of what we as staff should be thinking about when opportunities to bank land become available?
And then, of course, bringing our partners into the discussion to see what's attractive to them.
And as a follow-up to that, I think, there's different types of housing production organizations, and some of them require a larger acreage. If they're coming in, even if you have to combine multiple properties together, they want a certain amount of volume in order for them to work. But others are not like that. And so I think when we think about this strategy, we also need to think about kind of a phasing of policy and then specific properties and which ones make sense to combine together for a larger development and which ones make sense to make available more quickly. I think all of those are parts of the question. And so today's conversation is really setting the table for these bigger discussions, if I'm tracking that correctly. Yes, Councilor Hanson.
And one more thing, I've been sitting on the big question for me, which is budgetary, and I don't know if there's a more appropriate place to talk about it in your presentation or if this is a good time to talk about.
The presentation is essentially concluded, so.
All right. Great. Well, thank you. Moving forward through the next budgetary cycle, is there something we can do? Are there models that we can point to? How do we budget for our aspirational goals? So acquiring property is something that we've done one or two. We have some recent examples. That's great. We have a lot of investments. We have a lot of cash on hand. Well, I mean, it's all relative. It's all relative. So we have investments. We have cash on hand. We have resources. And how does that look for us in the next budgetary cycle? Where does that conversation start?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, finance is starting to do the projections now for our next budgeting cycle to see where we're at. And, part of what we've done in the past is kind of keep track of, for lack of a better word, the council wish list. What are the priorities that, council and the community are setting? So when we get past our, obligated services and we have funds that we want to dedicate to the good of the community, what are those areas? So for example, this past budget, wildfire was number one. We put a lot of resources towards wildfire mitigation. Definitely affordable housing is something that has come up, even with last budget cycle, and affordability with childcare. So there are items where we're going to have to, as we move through the budget process, decide, what are our priorities for this biennium. And we probably also need to be thinking about, acquiring enough funds for purchasing property. That may take several budget cycles, depending on what we're looking to acquire. And so, one of the things Brandon and I have talked about is, the housing trust fund or the housing fund. Do we change kind of how that operates and work with Housing and Human Services to rethink that, some of those funds we're holding kind of in savings over time to have funds available to purchase properties if they are to become available that are in our map of kind of lands we're interested in for banking, or is there another strategy council has in mind? So that is something we're going to need to have a discussion about as we move forward. I think there's several items that council is interested in pursuing. If the city has the funds to do that, and affordable housing is definitely on there. But I also think we're going to need a long-term mechanism to accumulate funds to be able to do this over time, because we're not going to have enough funds, for example, in the next budget cycle, just to probably purchase all of the lots that we'd be interested in purchasing at once.
Well, I'll challenge you there. How much do we have in investments that we could put into affordable housing land banking? And what are the state laws around using investments for other investments?
Investments for other investments. So I think something to keep in mind with investments is some of that is general fund and some of that is not. So we are talking about general fund investments in affordable housing. In terms of how much we would need to pull out of our investments, that's a discussion to be had with finance to evaluate, what we
Right.
need to keep in terms of growing and making sure we have enough in reserve versus what we want to expend.
We've been the benefit of extra, if you would, additional funds like we put towards wildfire in this last quarter. That was, in my mind, found money because of investments, as opposed to investing in real estate for land banking, which is never going to yield extra investments for us. Interesting strategies. Okay.
Well, and one of the other things I think for us to keep in mind is that the governor has, in the first year of the housing and homelessness crisis, was focused primarily on shelter beds and is now pivoting towards housing. And so there is likely to be funding available for purchasing and land banking if there is a clear partnership in place that points to that land being developed quickly. And so I think one of those things that I don't think we have this in our list of projects for looking for funding that we're out scanning for funding on. But it seems that maybe this is one of the things that we should be doing as we look at not just certainly not the properties the city owns, but the properties that are out there that we think would be particularly useful. And so it seems that we should move on developing the policy angle of this around, are we going to do this as a city, or are we going to support a land bank, making decisions and going in these directions so that we understand what is an opportunity if land comes available, or we go out and proactively see if there is availability of particular pieces of land so that we can put these projects together with potentially some grant funding. And so that's the other piece of this that kind of comes in alongside what resources does the city have, is we happen to be in a moment in time when there's a lot of infrastructure and housing investment that's happening, and in fact a lot of additional investment mechanisms that are being developed around resilience and economic, low income, assisting low income populations. So it seems to me that we can figure out those different financing elements, but in the meantime, what do you need from this body in terms of direction?
Whatever direction you want to provide. For the most part, we had identified this, and I noted it in the memo, as one of the 15 strategies to be undertaken in 2026. I recognize that if there are funds available for acquisition of property that the city would want to pursue, we could, be aware of those grant opportunities and pursue them, with the idea of a land bank being the repository. I don't know that, this is me speculating, that you would have a very competitive grant to apply for funding to put land in a bank without a development proposal immediately as part of that package. But that said, I think, the disposition of the surplus city property, that's a council discussion of whether that is reserved for future housing development. But again, I guess I'd look to you as to how aggressive the council would be in terms of accelerating this production strategy over others that were scheduled for 24, 25. So.
And what are the others?
The manufactured home park zone development would be the primary one in terms of staff time developed to creating that new zoning type.
And what is the timeline for that?
Yeah.
Pardon me?
Community Land Trust was it?
Yeah. So that was.
And the Community Land Trust is the other one, but the Community Land Trust, I think, is up and running already. I mean, it's that process there is one that's formed. And so we don't necessarily have to build a land trust like we thought we might have to. And so what is the timing for the mobile home zoning question? When do we think that would be done?
We did receive a grant from the Department of Land Conservation and Development to assist with that. And their term of their scope of work goes out to May of 2025.
So does that mean that we would not be able to start this until May of 2025, these policy discussions?
Depending on the scope of the work that you're looking at doing. If it is a comprehensive assessment of properties, identifying, working with a realtor to find properties to acquire, going through a budgetary process to identify how much funding is available, that's quite a bit of additional work. If it's really just direction from council in terms of what type of land bank you would like to participate in and whether the council would be the entity that is owning and maintaining those properties and determining that policy, that's a little more limited. So I haven't done much in terms of assessing all those steps because we haven't had this discussion yet.
And alongside that is the question of the city's surplus property, right? So that's something that it seems like we could make some movement on earlier rather than later. We've also talked about above the Hargadine garage and potentially putting an RFP out for that. And so we do have some individual pieces of land. And so I wonder, I know that this council has said previously that the mobile home zoning piece is very important. That came really very high. So I'm not seeing anyone interested in pushing that aside. Okay. So what if we set ourselves to a work plan that included setting that policy direction for the land bank? Is it internal? Is it external? Which way do we want to go with that? And then having that conversation and providing the direction for the individual pieces of property that are not the big visioning pieces, not Imperatrice necessarily in Hardesty, but the smaller pieces. Are there things that we can get out into the world in terms of possible development opportunistically or in that way? And then having that discussion about what types of properties are opportunities, so that if staff sees something come available, they know that they've got the direction from council to at least investigate whether that's something that can be done with current financing. In that, and see where we get with those three things. How does that sound? Or are there other elements that we should put in here? Because we, of course, have to be careful that we don't overrun the staff availability and timing.
Yeah.
Councillor Kaplan.
Yeah, to my mind, a piece of this is the Community Land Trust, and I know that we've got a group that's up and running to try to build some capacity. We provided some resources for that, but I'd be interested in exploring what the city's role might be in a public-private Community Land Trust partnership, because I know that the history in the past was that it was difficult to have a fully private Community Land Trust organization sustainable over time. So I would be interested in other ways to maybe increase the chances of its long-term viability by some city support mechanism, supporting either back office functions or just providing a feeder for the land. Of course, the land banking and community land trusts are often kind of done hand in hand.
Well, and that's one of the other elements of the housing production strategy, is to work with or in some way support. So I think that's another question to be taken up, is what does that look like from the city's standpoint? Other thoughts? Councillor Hyatt. I'm just looking for a full picture of this in the context of, Brandon, I think we just heard from ComDev on the results of the MAC, and you're going to be working the MAC results in the 25-26 timeframe. You got 4 big rocks on the plate right now in the 24-25 timeframe. So in light of what we're trying to feather in here on top of that, do you need us to take something off? Because that's a lot.
It is, and I can take a look at this and be better able to answer that question after looking at what this scope of work would entail.
Okay.
I hesitate. I know that we've got 5 major projects currently ongoing, and the DP MAC, a number of administrative changes that are important that we'd like to make, and they are all competing for essentially a 1 FTE person, which is 50% me, 50% the senior planner, to do that work. So it is a lot of work, but we've got some consultants assisting us on a number of those projects. So until we have those scopes of work nailed down, I may not be able to give the best assessment of where this could plug in. We're also going to run up against a capacity issue, just to be frank, not just of staff, but of Planning Commission and City Council. You only have 2 meetings, or 2 or 4 meetings respectively per month, and we are going to be coming to you quite a bit with a number of these projects to get your direction. So
we can call additional meetings. I know no one likes that. If not to push your team too hard, but there's a moment in time, and I'm not sure exactly the best way to balance that moment in time, but the resources that are flowing now are not going to be flowing forever. And that's what I think we have to figure out how to balance. And if there's a way to get additional consulting support in, if there is something that can be done. It seems that we've had some of these surplus land conversations before. I think there's some background information that's available to them. I don't know how much time each of those pieces would take, but I think we have to be careful to not say we want all of this done yesterday. And so is it enough for us to give you that guidance? Does the guidance sound correct in terms of what we would be looking for next? But then to ask you to feather that in and bring it to us, as expeditiously as you can do while maintaining an appropriate work-life balance.
So if I could just make sure that I heard correctly. So what I would kind of propose back to you all is, it sounds like in terms of the property the city owns, we are interested in pursuing possible development options with that if there is state funding available. So that is something we need to keep an eye at, because we own the land and we can move forward with the land that we own if we so choose. The second step is looking at acquiring more land for land banking. And with that, I would propose a following Parks and Recreation model that they've used to acquire property, which is identify parcels that we would be interested in the event that they become available, and make that known, because I know there are members of this community who have approached the city before and are interested in the use of their land that way. And then third, we develop kind of staff's thought on what it would look like to have a community land trust and what the role of the city would be in that, and provide that feedback back to council to help move that forward if that opportunity comes forward.
And I think the other piece is just answering the question of, are we looking to do land banking internally, or is that an again, like the land trust, is it an external organization that we are partnering with in some fashion? I think that question might be a pretty easily answered question, given the city's successful past and the fact that we don't have an existing nonprofit land bank.
So I think maybe right now we are the bankers.
Yeah, well, exactly.
And then as opportunity arises, or if that develops and we find a partner that's a good fit, then we kind of reevaluate what our role is and what that bank land means moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Councilor Hanson.
And Mayor, if I heard you correctly, you were also asking about financing, grant opportunities, and there was a financial component, and that was missing, I think, from what you were saying, Sabrina. Would be a fourth component would be, the opportunities that are out there, and then to the question I had of, are there existing funds that we could use within the general fund?
Yeah, I think
Something I'm curious about. But
just to set expectations, with the reason we've had so much interest and been able to earn so much interest is we've had so many delayed capital projects. And so we've had money sitting in the bank, but now we are doing those projects. So we're not going to have as much money sitting in the bank earning interest. So I just want to set expectations around using that surplus, actually having that surplus money, because we are expending quite a bit of those funds through this budget cycle to get at some of our capital projects. Of course, we're always going to look to make good investments. We want to make money off of our money, but I don't want us to think that we will always have this amount of ability to be able to pull in extra interest, for example, to continue to cover things. That's to be determined as we work through our financial forecasting into the future. But definitely something to keep an eye on.
Councilor Duquesne.
Thank you, Mayor. Something that I wanted to touch on, what Councilor Hanson brought up about additional properties, and I agree with you when you said that it's going to take another biennium. Let's look at the budget to be, I don't want to be a naysayer. However, I don't want to take the money that we have that's funding things now to go out on a limb and buy new property. And something that you mentioned, Brandon, is about what's on your plate, and your plate is full. I think to be able to look at what we have now is what the city already owns, that we are quasi-banking. I think that might be the easier approach and the most direct approach, is to see what we have now and not go out and find additional property that we would have to find money for to pay that. I would rather budget for additional property and work what we have now and do the suggestions that Mayor Graham brought forward and keep it simple and more direct.
Councillor Dale.
Thank you, Mayor. Brandon, I think it goes, we don't say this enough, but I would like to offer our appreciation for all of your institutional knowledge and your relationships that you have personally with developers and other organizations and members of this community with respect to doing what's best for the long-term strategy and goals of Ashland. So what I would like to say is as a solid start and continuance with the DPMAC and finding out what are the impediments or the obstacles or other things that maybe isn't brought to the attention of council on a frequent basis. But as we start to accelerate this timeline, which is the right thing to do, as it is, we needed this yesterday and before. I firmly believe there's an absolute implicit trust that you and the planning department and ConDev and indeed the entire city is not going to break this city. That said, if you come across things, and not adding anything, but and I know you know this, I just want to reiterate for the community, as you come across things that we may stub our toe on or that we need to be able to, that are just on the books or other things that has prevented us from doing something in the past, that bring it to this body's attention or whatever we need to do internally so that we can not, for lack of a better term, have self-inflicted or unforced errors, right, relative to this. So thank you.
Thank you for that.
So I think I've been seeing some head nods with the general direction of these elements, not telling ComDev to move other projects aside, but to bring these other elements in. The one question that still sits for me that I'm not sure we have been as clear for staff about is what is our approach to opportunistic circumstances? Right. So a piece of property comes available. It's one of those places that could be developed for a significant number of units. It could be developed for affordable housing if the city buys it quickly, but it won't be if the city is not likely to be if the city doesn't take advantage and quickly move on it. Do we want the staff to be paying attention to those sorts of things and come to us in the event, like what we have happened with Parks and Rec, when they see a property? Now, they have inventoried, and we're not asking staff to do that. But I think it's also pretty clear that we know what types of properties are likely to be opportunities in this overall scheme. So do we want, if staff sees an opportunity with a large piece of land that's suddenly coming on the market or some particular property that they think we would be interested in, do we want them to bring it to us because it's not planned ahead of time? Head nods.
Yeah, you're resounding
Head nods.
yes.
I think so.
I would say yes, with the caveat then this body has to be accepting that something else is not going to happen within a timeline. So if there's something related to CFA that we have going on, something with the economic opportunity analysis that we have going on, initial steps with ADU plans that are canned and ready to rock, and those get delayed, we have to understand that we have to give some room for that if we're going to ask for that kind of opportunity citing and, taking that sidetrack for a short time until we come back through and not demand it all at once.
And I could just add, the difference between this and Parks is Parks has money appropriated to acquire land in the budget. We're not going to have that. So along with work plan stuff maybe being put on hold, that maybe something else is not happening altogether because we're going to have to divert funding in order to be able to make a land purchase.
And I think we want to also just give staff the not even so much the permission, but the request to bring us those questions when they come up, because we know that there are a lot of challenges that we're facing, and we want to see opportunities in a variety of things that might come up, but we also don't know what the workload looks like. So if opportunities are coming, I think that this council would be interested in hearing not only what are the opportunities, but what is it that staff needs us to pull back on the throttle on, so that we can move forward with something that this council sees as an opportunity. So if that sounds right to folks, then does that give you both the direction that you need from us?
I think it does.
Anything give you heartburn, Brandon?
A little bit of that as well.
Well, please just continue to bring us your best estimate of what it takes so that we protect our staff from too many ambitions. Great. All right, well, thank you. And with that, meeting is adjourned.